What Hugh Hefner never figured out.
Television host Bill Maher, known for his political commentary, was recently discussing some rules for relationships. With 3 women guests on the panel, he said, "Don't gripe about porn." When they asked what he meant, he responded, "Unless you women are willing to give us sex whenever we want, you don't have the right to gripe if we use pornography." After hearing his explanation, all 3 women readily agreed that the rule made sense. Surprised? Most aren't. Maher's rule and the response from these women simply demonstrate the prevalent view our society holds about men and sex. That is, the purpose of sex for men is primarily personal pleasure, and we won't be denied it. Of course, this attitude didn't start with Bill Maher. He was simply drinking the Kool-Aid of an unknown copywriter in Chicago who stirred up the belief decades earlier when he started a magazine called Playboy. Pasted up on a card table in his apartment, the first issue featured a centerfold of Marilyn Monroe reclining nude on a carpet of red satin. Of course, that man was Hugh Hefner, and he was not only selling a magazine, he was selling sex. More specifically, he was selling a new sexual ethic. He was doing nothing less than starting a revolution by asking 1950s America to trade in its sexual repression for what he called a liberated lifestyle. In the post-war era of the 1950s, skin magazines and smut films were only available to those who knew where to find them, typically at back-alley newsstands or seedy adult theaters. Hefner wanted to change all that. But how do you take such an upheaval of hedonistic values mainstream? The key for Hefner was to create an upscale image for Playboy and carefully edge it toward the middle. As one commentator said, he combined Esquire's literary sophistication with the sort of artful nudes one could find in camera magazines like Popular Photography. Unlike other men's magazines of the day, Playboy didn't run crime stories or articles about fishing. From the start, it emphasized being stylish, in the know, and cool. "We enjoy mixing up cocktails," he wrote in the first issue, "putting a little mood music on the phonograph and inviting in a female acquaintance for a quiet discussion on Picasso, Nietzsche, jazz, sex." Nothing too overt, just subtle and sophisticated. In 1959, Hefner began a syndicated television program to show men what the bachelor pad lifestyle could be like. Every week, a party was in progress, and Hefner, wearing a tux, invited viewers inside to meet his pals and mingle with, in quotes, the girls. Innocent and harmless, right? That was the idea. So was he really on a crusade to rewrite the system of sexual ethics for our day? Absolutely. He made that abundantly clear. His strategy was to remove the shame from self-centered sex by linking the pornographic lifestyle to cultural respect, big money, and political power. His goal was to free men from self-restraint and eliminate what he called the evils of sexual inhibition. In 1962, with one of the fastest-selling magazines in publishing history, Hefner wrote The Playboy Philosophy, a manifesto attempting to explain how Puritanism had led our nation into sexual repression that demanded a transformation. But Hefner stopped composing his credo when he saw the cultural transformation he was demanding well on its way, much faster than he thought. By the mid-1970s, his empire included not only his magazine, but also movie production, casinos, resorts, and an international chain of private clubs where waitresses dressed as bunnies, complete with ears and tail. The rabbit head Playboy logo appeared on countless mainstream products, even air fresheners hanging from the rearview mirrors in cars of men who were hip like Hef. But during the 1980s, cracks appeared in the Playboy airbrush facade that would eventually reveal what was beneath the subtle and sophisticated surface of Hefner's cultural empire. Competing magazines offered men far more graphic pictorial spreads. The publisher of Penthouse, Bob Guccione, is proud of his own contribution to the sexual liberation of Western civilization. "We are the first to show full frontal nudity," he wrote. From Hefner's view, Penthouse, not Playboy, was now leading the way. When Playboy sales began to slide, the cover of Newsweek put it plainly, "Playboy, the party's over." But behind the scenes, the party was only beginning for Hefner. His dream of moral and cultural upheaval was becoming a powerful reality, and the declining sales of his soft porn magazine were an indicator. Why? Because the liberated man of Hefner's world wanted more than scantily clad airbrush blondes. Turned out, he didn't want to leave anything to the imagination. Profits from Hefner's magazine started sinking, but thanks to making porn the norm, he's still rich. Why? Because Playboy is heavily invested in X-rated videos. Playboy Enterprises became the first explicitly pornographic business to go public, with shares traded in the stock market. As you probably know, pornography is now a major American industry, worth billions annually. But did you also know it is worth more than Major League Football, baseball, and basketball combined? As Matthew Scully commented in the Wall Street Journal, it was Mr. Hefner who put the real money in porn, a business hard to go poor in under any circumstances, and today a $57 billion a year global industry. He brought it into the central stream of culture so that now even upscale bookstores stock Penthouse or similar offerings without a second thought. He gave porn that, in quotes, classy feel, and its phony creed of artistic expression and protected speech by which far livelier fare than Playboy would soon ease into popular culture. While upholding Playboy's image as a classy publication, selling itself as soft porn, Hefner and his company quickly ventured into the hardcore sectors of the squalid business of pornography. As Scully remarked, Playboy Enterprises itself, years ago, dropped the pretense of refinement and delicacy, following the money into hardcore cable. Softcore, hardcore, these were all along just degrees of exploitation and self-debasement, and for the procurers a purely legal and commercial calculation. The mild porn of Hugh Hefner's 1950s dressed itself up in a smoking jacket and pretended for a while to be sophisticated and cool. But it was always just about the business of pornography. It was always about the hedonistic sexual satisfaction of men and nothing more. So, should we really be surprised when a few decades later Bill Maher proclaimed that one of the rules for relationships is that women shouldn't gripe about pornography if they aren't giving us sex whenever we want it? Should it surprise us that 3 articulate women agreed on national television to this logic? Should it surprise us that none of them pointed to the obvious fact that displaying sex publicly changes and degrades its nature? Hugh Hefner thinks of himself as a prophet, even a missionary, who has led America out of sexual repression into a new era of sexual freedom. He never admits that it is all based on a lie, probably because he was too intoxicated on his own hedonistic hysteria to even notice. He never figured out that the sexually liberated society he envisioned, and that we now live in, is built on a warped and distorted attitude towards sex. By the standards of today's, in quotes, liberated man, the purpose of sex is personal pleasure, and women, along with pornography or whatever else strikes his fancy, are to be used as a means to achieving it. In Hef's world, women are merely sexual playthings for male fantasies. Hefner, in his drive to free us from sexual self-restraint and modesty, has neglected to figure out the true purpose and pleasure of sex. Of course, that's understandable. He's not looking for it. He's not attempting to live his life by God's standards. Quite the contrary. He even scoffs at the idea of sexual morality. He doesn't care to be honorable and monogamous in his sex life. But you and I do. And that's why for us, the purpose of sex is paramount. It's tough these days to remember that a man used to be able to wake up to a world without Girls Gone Wild or Sex.com, without stunning women modeling lingerie on primetime TV commercials, without cable or internet porn for all hours and all ages. If you travel, it's tough to recall when you could check into a hotel without pay-as-you-view porn in your room. But as distant as it might seem, it wasn't all that long ago when you could actually go about daily life without ever encountering pornographic images. That's why, in the sexually saturated society, I dedicate this chapter to helping us, both you and me, recall the real purpose of sex. So what is it? Why did God create sex? Procreation is the obvious answer. God clearly gave us sex to make babies. Just see Genesis 1. But he also had something more in mind. God wants us to take pleasure in sex. If you don't believe me, read the Old Testament book Song of Songs. It is replete with erotic metaphors and sexual excitement. And consider the fact that unlike most animals that only have sex during the female's fertile period, God created us to continually enjoy sexual intimacies within marriage. In addition, the human species is one of very few in which females experience orgasm, and humans continue to have sex long after their childbearing years have passed. You don't have to be a Bible scholar to get this message. 1 Corinthians 7:3-5 says this, The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also to her husband. In the same way, the husband's body does not belong to him alone, but also to his wife. Do not deprive each other. As one of my seminary professors once said after reading this passage aloud in class, the Bible is clear as it can be. It says if you're married, do it. He was making his point emphatically because people outside the church, and some deeply religious people, think of God as the great spoil-sport of human sexuality, not its inventor. But truth be told, sex is a gift from on high. Okay, so God created sex for pleasure, but the purpose of sex goes deeper than pleasure. It holds more meaning than feeling good. Are you ready for this? Sex is not only designed to make you happy, but to make you holy. That's right. Sex is as much spiritual as it is physical. Sex can bring you closer to the one who created it. When you think of what sex does for you personally, I would guess that making you holy isn't the first thing that comes to mind. But hear me out. If the purpose of sex was limited to procreation and pleasure, it would merely be an animalistic act. But for humans, it's about relationship. That's the key. It's a personal encounter, not just a biological action. Think about how we humans have sex compared to other mammals. We are the only species that commonly copulate face to face so that partners look at each other as they mate. Why? Because human sex is designed to be more than physical. Sex may engage our body, but it also touches our soul. Perhaps that's why G.K. Chesterton once said, "Every man who knocks on the door of a brothel is looking for God." When we sever the connection of sex from the sacred, we neglect our spiritual longings. Our modern fixation with sex is a symptom of a breakdown in intimacy. Having detached the physical act of sex from relationship, we become spiritually bankrupt. And I've worked with enough men in my counseling office to see firsthand the desperate looks of loneliness and despair when men have compulsively reduced sex to simple self-gratification. It's inevitable when we neglect the sacred aspects of the gift of sex. The very word sex comes from the Latin verb that means to cut off or sever, and as Philip Yancey writes in Rumors of Another World, sexual impulses drive us to unite, to restore somehow the union that has been severed. He points out that Freud diagnosed the pain deep within humans as a longing for union with a parent. Carl Jung diagnosed the same longing as a desire for union with the opposite sex. Christians see an even deeper longing, a longing for union with the God who created them. Now let's be honest. Historically, the church has had a tough time getting this one straight. Against the background of a pagan culture where temple prostitutes were incorporated into worship, the church set up some serious, if not irrational, taboos. St. Augustine, who was converted out of that pagan background and tormented by his own sexual past, proclaimed that sex for any purpose other than procreation is a sin. The Protestant Reformation eventually brought about a shift in attitudes toward sex. Luther scorned the church's prohibition against marital sex for the sake of pleasure. Yet in time, the Victorians brought sexual repression back to England and America, even to the extent of covering the legs of furniture, lest they arouse impure thoughts. Talk about crazy sex. But here we are in a new day. We are not so much at risk of repressing our sexuality as we are for neglecting its spiritual transcendence. We are at risk for losing its meaning by reducing it to mere instinct, a pleasurable biological act, void of a spiritual connection. What happens when a man connects his spiritual and his sexual sides? Repression? Frustration? Shame? Not if he's relatively healthy. I love what Yancey says. When I experience desire, I need not flinch in guilt, as if something unnatural has happened. Rather, I should follow the desire to its source, to learn God's original intent. He's saying that a sexual impulse can and should take us to God's original purpose in creating us as sexual beings. He created us for relationship, and a relationship does not get more personal or more sacred than when it is consummated in making love. I want to say this straight. Sex is more than physical. It's more than treating another human being like a plaything. It is spiritual. And that's why it is designed to make us holy. Now, I can already hear your questions. Are you saying that the more sex I have, the more spiritual I am? Are you saying that I'm supposed to be thinking religious thoughts while making love? Of course not. Don't misread me here. You and I both know that sex is complex. It's influenced by mood, levels of stress, constraints of time, sleep, and so on. Remembering that sex is spiritual as well as biological, that it's about a deep and profound connection that resides between two souls, does not guarantee that we will realize anything more than physical gratification in our sex lives. Sex doesn't promise a spiritual epiphany. After all, marriage is composed of two people who have bad moods, stressful schedules, and imperfect hygiene. As a man, you live with a wife who needs patience, respect, understanding, kindness, nurturing, acceptance, devotion, forgiveness, and so many other honorable qualities. And you need the same from her. Admit it, for when you do, you've recalibrated your sex life for relationship, and that's where the holiness of sex resides. Before we leave this chapter and address the myths head on, I've got to ask you a question. Are you envious of Hugh Hefner? Be honest. Don't answer reflexively with spiritual platitudes. Don't answer with how you think you should answer. Just be honest with yourself. As I've been writing this chapter, I cannot help but to wonder what it would be like to throw off all sexual morals and inhibitions and live the self-indulgent life of Hugh Hefner, complete with the girls next door at my beck and call, attending pajama parties and all the rest. After all, as Hefner says, he's living out every man's dream. Needless to say, it's not my dream. But it's certainly a fantasy that can't be ignored. I have to admit it. A part of me is envious. What man wouldn't like a bevy of voluptuous women in their 20s as playmates? But would I trade places with him? Not on your life. Like you, I've chosen a different path, one seemingly less traveled in our contemporary culture. You and I have chosen a higher road, but let's not pretend that the part of us that fantasizes about the playboy lifestyle isn't real. Why? Because when we do, we are only deluding ourselves into believing that we are immune to falling off the high road we've chosen to travel. And as we are about to see, that's one of the biggest myths of all.
For reflection. 1. What would it do for you personally if tomorrow you woke up in a time before Playboy, when sexual images were not so explicit in the mainstream as they are today? 2. What do you think about the idea that sex engages not only our body, but also touches our soul? What does this mean to you, and how do you personally relate to it? 3. What, if anything, do you envy about Hugh Hefner's lifestyle? Why have you made choices that are opposed to it?